All right, we're ready to begin. Thank you all for coming. My name is Razi Ginsberg. I'm the founder and director of the Ayn Rand Center UK, an organization that works to promote Rand's philosophy, objectivism, in the UK. Before we start, can I ask by show of hands who here has read any of Rand's books or essays? All right, well, a bunch of you haven't, and you have something great to look forward to. So just a few words on Rand and on what we do. So Rand is best known for her novels The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and as a philosopher, probably mostly known for her political views, but she wrote extensively on metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and even on psychology. The London Ayn Rand Meetup runs a weekly discussion group every Wednesday on Rand's ideas and how to apply them to your life. Next week's discussion is on the is-ought gap, the question of whether values can be derived from facts, and Rand's answer to that question. And the following week, we'll be discussing her essay, The Psychoepistemology of Art, the first essay in her book, The Romantic Manifesto on the Importance and Necessity of Art. Rand referred to her philosophy as a philosophy for living on Earth, and her ideas, unlike those of most other philosophers, are meant to be usable in everyday life. Our next psychology talk will be here on Tuesday, November 5th. Ayn Rand Center UK psychology fellow Josh Dixon will be giving a talk on psychology and sense of life. If you're interested in any of these events or you want to take a look at future ones, go on meetup.com or download the Meetup app, look up Ayn Rand, and join the Ayn Rand Meetup where we have the next month of events posted. Almost all of the Ayn Rand Center events are free to attend, but none of them are free for us to run. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors who make it possible for us to make these events happen. Primarily Carl Barney's Prometheus Foundation, which supports projects around the world that advance Rand's philosophy of objectivism, and our Ayn Rand Center UK members. We've significantly increased the number of events we're running this year compared to last, and we want to do that again next year. So if you enjoyed tonight's event and want to see more like it, consider joining the membership program at aynrandcenter.co.uk/membership. You'll also enjoy 15% off food and drink at the Crosswall, which is the restaurant where we have our weekly discussions. You'll also, depending on membership level, enjoy perks like online and print subscriptions to the Objective Standard magazine, which you can also buy at our events, and Harry Binswanger Letter, an online philosophy forum run by objectivist philosopher Harry Binswanger. And discounts on Ayn Rand Institute conferences and a bunch of other perks. Now for tonight's event. Our speaker is Dr. Gena Gorlin. Dr. Gorlin is a tenure-track professor in the clinical psychology doctorate program in the Furkauf Graduate School of Psychology in New York. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Virginia. Those of you who are objectivists probably know that she won the Fountainhead Essay Contest 2 years in a row. And for the past 3 years at the Objectivist Summer Conference, she won the Razi Ginsberg Award for Best Talk. So her talk tonight, and that's a very important award. There's very strong competition for that. Her talk tonight is titled, Earning Your Own Trust, The Psychology of Honesty. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Gena Gorlin.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, Razi, for that very generous introduction and great honor that you've bestowed on me. So it's really a pleasure to be here today. As you can see, my talk is titled Earning Your Own Trust, The Psychology of Honesty. And there's a particular reason why I'm giving this particular talk this year, 2019. In part because it's a special anniversary for me. About 10 years ago, in roughly 2009, I had a pivotal experience that has put my life on a dramatically better trajectory since the moment that it occurred. You might think, given where we are and the nature of this meetup that I'm talking about, having discovered Rand's novels and ideas, that had actually happened sometime earlier, maybe a good 5 years prior. What happened 10 years ago was a much quieter, more introspective experience that really changed how I understood and thought about Rand's ideas in my own life. The triggering event, as I might now refer to it, was quite trivial. Someone said something that, in a nutshell, was crazy and had no real basis, but they accused me of something, and it was the kind of thing that if a friend had told me, this person said this to me, I would have immediately dismissed it as completely meaningless, and I would have told them as much. But somehow, because it was me, I couldn't be so sure. And so I promptly messaged one of my friends and respected colleagues in the objectivist community, and I told him the story so that he could reassure me that I wasn't crazy. And then at some point in this process, I stepped back and I thought, why do I need to hear this from him? What the hell? What does he know that I don't know about this situation? Why don't I trust my judgment as much as I trust his? And then one such observation led to another, and the next thing I knew, I was in a state of what at the time I referred to as tear-stained misery, journaling furiously about all the things that I didn't really trust myself about and all the neurotically insecure, reassurance-seeking behavior that I engaged in as a result, and how painfully embarrassing this was to me. Mind you, by this point, I had graduated from the Ayn Rand Institute's Academic Center, a 4-year intensive training program in Rand's philosophy. I'd read most of Rand's published fiction and nonfiction multiple times through. I'd published many objectivism-inspired articles in various campus newsletters, including one I participated in founding. In fact, I could recite the arguments for being independent-minded, relying on your own judgment, backwards and forwards, and I had, many times. Yet here I was, unable to trust myself with something so simple and basic as a crazy, meaningless insult that someone had directed at me. For those who've read The Fountainhead, you might resonate with this when I say it just wasn't very Rourke-like of me. So then I figured out, or started to figure out, what the problem was. I didn't trust myself because, in a sense, I hadn't done the work of earning my own trust. As I continued to journal, I realized all of the little ways and the bigger ways that I have continually and routinely lied to myself. By doing things like making excuses for why I couldn't get started on something, like I'm too tired tonight, I'll do it tomorrow, when I kind of knew that I wouldn't do it tomorrow, or when I knew that that wasn't really the reason, blaming my problems on my upbringing, or on the culture, or on my own mental health issues, or the state of the world, instead of really taking responsibility for trying to fix them, staying in bad relationships longer than I should have, and telling myself I just didn't have enough information when really I just was afraid of being lonely. The list just went on and on. In the spirit of being honest and earning trust, I'm actually going to read you all a few passages from that pivotal journal entry that, happily for me, I documented all those 10 years ago. Quote, "I don't trust myself to be objective. I think that really is a key to it. Maybe it's because I've set a bad precedent." I'm weeping, by the way, as I write this. Now it's all happy-go-lucky. But I've rationalized and let my emotions cloud my thinking about myself too many times, and I know it. The fact that even at this moment I'm resisting this conclusion so much emotionally, and I'm so tempted to find some reason to discard it, only makes it the more compellingly plausible. And I went on. "Perhaps this is the day I will confess to myself that I have been at base immoral, and that if I want to feel better, I must not blame everything on my, leave out some of the colorful detailed circumstances, my mental health issues, my childhood's worth of being derided, though those things may have related to my choice to have started rationalizing and lying to myself in the first place. I must acknowledge my own fault, and I must start to rectify it. Perhaps that is the only way that I can truly remedy my own psychology. And, well, 10 years later, I can tell you that this entry and this hypothesis turned out, though perhaps a bit harsh, but fundamentally, essentially true, and has borne out in the years since. So that fateful entry, which is now labeled in my journals as Moral Revelation, aka the earliest and truest precursor to the Honesty Log. I'll tell you about the Honesty Log in a little bit. It turned out to be the launching point for a personal and professional journey that has astronomically improved my life at every level, turning me into a happier, more fulfilled, more successful, accomplished human that I could have ever imagined becoming at that time. And of course, it's still a process. The journey still continues to this day. 10 years of professional psychological research as well as clinical practice, combined with continued philosophical study, have given me a lot more data points than just my own momentary experience, and a lot of opportunities to conceptualize the psychology of honesty. This has been a major theme in my professional career. I've worked with a wide range of clients, and it's a consistent theme that comes up across different kinds of problems, across diverse backgrounds and needs and mental health challenges and goals. And indeed, in my current research, of which this publication is a recent example, it focuses on training people how to cultivate what I've been calling cognitive integrity, or a commitment to being actively honest with ourselves. By this, I specifically mean a deeply internalized commitment to being really in touch with reality, in touch with both your internal, as well as external experience, to such a point that seeking out facts and wanting to know the truth becomes second nature to us, even when it's really painful or hard. So today, my goal is to share with you all what I've learned, at least a preview of everything I've learned over these 10 years, both through my own work at fulfilling the promise of that tear-stained journal entry and through the research and the clinical experience that it has inspired. So part of what I discovered through that initial introspective experience is that there is a psychology of honesty. Okay, that may not be a term you hear every day. What does that mean? So there are various philosophical arguments for honesty and for rationality and for independence as life-promoting virtues. And Ayn Rand is one of the people who really celebrates these virtues. There's the idea that we need to face facts as they are, the famous idea that Francis Bacon verbalized as nature to be commanded must be obeyed. But then there's also a lot of psychological work that's needed in order to really program this knowledge into ourselves, this perspective, to really build that philosophical understanding into our souls. So in the rest of this talk, I'm first going to provide some brief, cursory theoretical background for understanding what it means to cultivate an honest soul and why we might want to do so, and how Rand's philosophical insights uniquely inform this project, or at least certainly have done so for me. And then I'm going to offer some suggestions for assessing your own psychological programming and identifying some common, what I consider honesty undermining beliefs and mental habits to watch for. And then I'm going to describe some strategies for actually building your psychology on a more solid and trustworthy foundation. So, first for some theoretical background. So as some of you may be aware, Ayn Rand upheld reason, right, the respect for facts above all else, as the chief source of whatever virtue and whatever joy we achieve on this earth. One of her groundbreaking insights, as I see it, was that exercising our reason, our rational faculty, is the source and the essence of our free will, our primary choice, as she called it. In any waking moment, as she wrote, quote, man can focus his mind to a full, active, purposefully directed awareness of reality, or he can unfocus it and let himself drift in a semi-conscious daze, merely reacting to any chance stimulus of the immediate moment. The extent to which you choose to focus your mind and actively maintain this state of full awareness she argued, is the fundamental gauge of your virtue and of the basic causal mechanism by which you shape your soul over time. The result of these accumulated choices to use your mind or not, and particularly to direct your mind toward knowing, toward facts or not, is your moral character. According to Rand, and as largely informed and inspired by Aristotle, one's moral character, or as she sometimes colloquially called it, one's soul, is the distinct way that one tends to feel, think, and behave across a lot of different situations in one's life as the result of the thinking that one has done and the premises or the moral values, the beliefs and the standards that one has accepted and automatized. So it's the distinct way one tends to feel, think, and act as a result of the moral values one accepts and automatizes. So, according to Rand, what this means for us is that we are beings of, quote, self-made soul, which means that we shape our moral psychologies over time through the choices that we routinely make or don't make, and the beliefs and standards we internalize, or as she calls it, automatize as a result. Now, the beliefs that we need to internalize in order to make honesty a part of our soul are on their face pretty simple. In fact, they're arguably self-evident when you really attend to them. Okay, they amount to the recognition that the real is unreal and therefore can have no value for us, and therefore that faking reality, that wishing reality were otherwise, isn't going to make it so, in a nutshell. But as I've learned over these 10 years, really making this basic recognition a part of ourselves, a part of our psychologies, and motivating to us on a day-to-day basis is actually an extremely exacting achievement. Something funny is happening to my screen, if I'm to be honest with you guys. Now it just... Don't look at that, please. There's honesty, and then there's just excess disclosure. Okay, here we go. So, where did we leave off here? Don't want to rob you guys of already bare bones theoretical background that I do think is important for us to know. Okay, so the idea that you can directly will yourself to exercise your mind at any point in time, and that doing so gives you power to shape the basic course of your life. It's a very liberating idea. And it also means that we can fail to exercise this choice. And, if this perspective is right, if it's onto something, then we can really screw up our lives as a result. Especially so, since most of us, as I will argue and I think show to some extent, most of us unwittingly swallow a lot of false beliefs and standards from very early on, which, as we'll see, can actually make self-deception more natural and motivating for us than honesty, particularly honesty with ourselves, at least in some circumstances. What's more, even small lies and deceptions can create a kind of snowball effect. Anytime we make up a little excuse for ourselves or we turn our minds away from an unpleasant fact, this affects our character in a way that chips away at our self-credibility and makes us less likely to want to face facts on the next encounter with something difficult. It affects our implicit beliefs, our habits, and our motivations. Indeed, perhaps it's not so surprising for those of you who are familiar with research in social psychology and experimental psychology broadly, that there are now hundreds of psychological experiments showing in various clever ways that most people lie to themselves a bunch of the time and avoid uncomfortable, unpleasant facts with very little prompting and persuasion. And yet, for those of you who've either been inspired by Ayn Rand's fictional protagonists, as I have, or better yet, have met some of their real-life counterparts, I think that we can say with some certainty that for some people out there, it doesn't seem to be that hard In fact, it seems second nature to be unconditionally honest with themselves, at least by and large, and when they're not, to correct it quickly and to own up to their mistakes, even when the truth is deeply painful or when the immediate consequences seem really high. And the good news is that there's a snowball effect here too. And this justifies my entire job and existence. So I hope it's true, and I've observed it many times. Okay, so being honest with yourself, even when it's painful or hard, is a kind of tonic. It's a rewarding experience in its own right on many levels, both immediately and in terms of the way that positive effects accrue for you over time the more that you practice it, and in terms of its gradual effects on your implicit beliefs, your habits, and your motivation. So the rest of this talk will be about the soul-building tools, if you will, that have helped me to build a more honest psychology both for myself and for many of my students and therapy clients over the years. The goal here, remember, is to train ourselves to love the real and recoil from the unreal in every particular situation, to see the value of accurate, undistorted awareness so clearly and vividly that the idea of faking reality, of telling a lie to ourselves or to a loved one, just simply has no appeal for us. It's to shape our soul in such a way that the value of being committed to reality and the deadliness of evading it has fully sunk in for us. It's become an aspect of our psychology, part of our moral character, our second nature. So that is what we're after with all of these tools that follow. The first step, as I discovered all those 10 years ago, is to be fully honest with ourselves about the ways that we're not there yet. Okay, so what this means is accepting that, like the rest of reality, our psychology is what it is. And mere wishing won't make it otherwise. And it means being willing to accept and even courageously embrace a lot of discomfort as you undergo the growing pains of identifying and pushing back against some of your less admirable psychological habits. Okay, this means understanding how the general framework that I just described specifically applies to you. Okay, it means recognizing that you have a psychology, each and every one of you, a character, a way that you've programmed yourself over the course of your life. And it means more than just recognizing it. Okay, it means being really actively, honestly curious about it. Okay, so apart from your conscious convictions, how's your subconscious doing? What state is it in now, both today and in this part of your life? What habits and patterns and tendencies do you notice in yourself, particularly what cognitive habits? So for example, when and about what do you feel curious? When are you really motivated to know something? And when are you perhaps motivated not to know? In other words, you need to get familiar with the patterns of thought, emotion, and action that currently come most naturally to you. And you need to evaluate just how solid or tenuous a relationship you've got with reality, with your world, as a result. So how do we do that? Sounds like a tall order, probably, and it is. But with this perspective in mind, I'm going to describe some usual suspects to watch for in your own psychology. Some of these are things that I still catch in myself to this day, and every time have to reapply this process and notice and correct and roll my eyes affectionately and say, seriously? Still, Gena? But knowing better than to waste time kicking myself, kind of reassert what I know. Okay? So I've chosen these particular examples because I've found that they're especially common and that they undermine our psychology in subtle but pernicious ways, whether or not we're explicitly aware of them. You'll note both of the sets of beliefs I'm about to describe involve some form of implicit or internalized moral standard. I don't think that's an accident. And I think it speaks to the importance of really consciously checking and critically reflecting on the moral standards that we've internalized, especially as adults when we have the cognitive faculties to do so, rather than leaving them up to the chance influences of our culture, our upbringing, etc. Okay, so note quickly here that this by no means is a comprehensive list of ways that your particular psychology might go wrong, or the kinds of honesty undermining habits that you might find in yourself. They may or may not accurately describe your particular psychology. But my advice is that you openly and curiously consider whether and how each of these tendencies might apply to you, and let this sensitize you to the more general process of monitoring and evaluating your own psychological habits in an active, uncensored way. As I said. All right. So first, and this is an insight I do owe in large part to Rand and subsequent scholars who've articulated this idea. One of the worst psychological destroyers of honesty and integrity is, ironically, the concept of a moral duty, a duty-based moral standard. So whatever of several mainstream moral codes you might have grown up with, you may have been taught to stake your self-esteem on standards that aren't anchored to and that even take precedence over maintaining an awareness of reality. This, in effect, forces us to take reality, to fake it rather sooner or later if we want to live up to those duty-based standards, or rather, more realistically, pretend to live up to them. Okay, and I'm going to give you guys some examples, though this can have endless variance. Okay, so it could be, for instance, that your parents or your teachers used guilting or nagging or the selective reinforcing of certain kinds of desirable behavior to get you to do what they wanted you to do, whether that's getting good grades or going to church or practicing your instrument, a particularly familiar example for me, or sharing with your siblings, etc. Or you may have been taught that the only way to get what you want or to avoid getting in trouble is by complying with other people's arbitrary social demands, for example. Okay, the result is that we internalize into our psychology our habits of thinking, our motivations, what Rand called second-handed, a kind of non-causal, arbitrary, externally based standard of approval. See, we learn to emotionally identify our own goodness with reference to some standard that serves as an authority for us. And we learn to evaluate the propriety of our decisions or actions in the same way, by doing a kind of mental authority check against whatever standards we've internalized. So to the extent that this has been the pattern, or at least some part of the pattern of your relationship with morality up to this point, a relationship that I analogize to that of the stereotypical Jewish mother, again, a particularly familiar kind of example, and her misbehaving child, then you may well have given up on taking the voice of morality very seriously. You know that you can't live up to all of its nagging demands, and so you come to resist the demands and to accept your chronic guilt as a kind of inevitable punishment for whatever bits of naughty indulgence you permit yourself. Like, I'm going to pretend to practice while I put a book on the stand and secretly read instead. That was one of my guilty indulgences, believe it or not. Not the worst of them, but an example when I was a kid. Okay, and this now becomes the default meaning that you implicitly attach to guilt. There's that old nag come to yell at me again. Better deny everything and hope she goes away soon. And then, when you feel the kind of earned guilt that correctly signals to you that you're undermining your own values, you're betraying your own trust, you may well dismiss it with that same kind of defeatist defiance, if you will. It's like a case of the boy who cried wolf, except instead it's the emotional mechanism that cried, hey, you're doing something wrong, okay? And that's too bad, because in my clinical experience and my personal experience, mild doses of genuine earned guilt, when attuned to and taken seriously, can be really useful reminders, can give us helpful corrective feedback to get us back on track, okay? So this is an example of the everyday psychological experience of really deep points in moral philosophy. Both in terms of motivation and in terms of cognitive habits, this kind of arbitrary impersonal moral standard, it can cut us off from direct contact with reality. So you might be thinking, how does this apply to me if I've rejected religion or what Rand called collectivism. I've rejected these duty-based standards. They no longer apply. Maybe by a show of hands. Raise your hand if you feel like you've cast this off, so it's not really that applicable to you. Okay, so not that many of you guys, but maybe a few. Okay, on reflection. But that doesn't mean you're off the hook. Because unfortunately, the method and the style of these kinds of standards, it remains in our psychology more often than not, even when the content has shifted. Okay? So for example, say that you've cast off whatever like organized religion or whatever quote, collectivistic moral standards that you grew up with, and now you're judging yourself by how well you exemplify the objectivist virtues of rationality and independence and productiveness. And I've seen this a lot. Okay, so now these become the new thou shalts and thou shalt nots, the new externally imposed mandates that you must adhere to in order to be granted permission, in effect, to exist and to go on doing what you're doing. Okay, now anytime you catch yourself acting on an irrational impulse, let's say, which is non-objectivist, it's non-rational, or you procrastinate on your work, or you feel a twinge of envy at someone else's achievements, you feel the emotional equivalent of like having sinned in the eyes of God, or of Ayn Rand, or whoever the case may be. Okay? And thus having lost your sanction, your permission to exist, in effect. So of course you're going to be tempted to rationalize and self-deceive like crazy, given that acknowledging your moral fault is worse than having this pretense that at least you're doing okay, is worse than at least getting away with it for now, which is an even worse surrender, seemingly, of your existence and of your right to be here. Okay, so you can start becoming attuned to these kinds of patterns in a few different ways. So first, if you make a point of really noticing and describing the quality of your emotional states at any given point in time, this can be really helpful for you. So for instance, you might start to notice the difference between emotions that have a clean, sincere quality to them, even if they may be mistaken or be based on kind of a partial knowledge, and ones that have this kind of dirty, defensive quality, almost as if they're trying to pull something over on you. And this can be true not only with guilt, but other emotions, like anger, for instance. Okay, so you might feel outwardly angry and resentful. Maybe you've either experienced this or you've seen other people kind of display this. But then when you really tune in, you might notice that actually you're hurt, or you're scared, or you're sad about something, and you're kind of covering it up with the anger, because you implicitly don't want to have to feel the other thing that feels more vulnerable. Okay, I've discussed this general process of introspecting and getting to know your implicit beliefs elsewhere, such as in a talk called Using Reason to Cultivate Passion, which you can find on YouTube. So I won't dwell on it here, but I'm happy to answer questions about it in the Q&A. Okay. Second thing is you can practice monitoring and identifying causal versus duty-based patterns of thinking in yourself. Okay. This comes from what I think is a really brilliant essay written by Rand called Causality versus Duty, where she makes some of these explicit kind of insights about the method and the tone of our thinking, what she called our psychoepistemology, in addition to the content per se. So you can be psychologically authoritarian or slavishly dutiful or dependent with ideas that extol independence and first-handedness and selfish, rational, causal thinking. And we'll see some examples of this later in the talk, and I'll note some suggestions for monitoring these kinds of patterns in a more systematic way when we get to the honesty log. Meanwhile, though, there's another related cluster of standards and mental habits that can form early on and that can keep us stuck in a pattern of dishonesty if we don't work on breaking them. Okay? The common belief at the root of these habits, which might seem like opposites to what we just talked about, but in some ways turn out to be similar in structure. So this belief that reality is entirely subjective, so if something feels true, it is good as is true. Okay? This belief is very easy for us to ingest, especially when we're young And we observe that if we proclaim our wishes loudly enough, or if we tantrum loudly enough, someone usually swoops in and grants our wishes, almost as if by magic. Okay? There's a moral psychology to being spoiled or coddled or just not consistently being held accountable. Such experiences can lead us to believe, at least implicitly, and to accept into our character what Rand called, quote, the primacy of consciousness, or in lay terms, this expectation that wishing will make it so. Okay, that we can somehow alter reality with our minds if we just think it hard enough. Okay? One psychological consequence of this is that our self-esteem becomes unmoored from any actual objective record of dealing competently with reality and therefore achieving our desires. Okay? Which then typically comes to bite us sooner or later when we start encountering real, genuine obstacles in the world that we can't just wish our way out of. This is related to one phenomenon that I've been seeing a lot in the US, and I'm curious if you guys notice it here, called failure to launch. When a young person either goes off to college, comes back weeks later, settles into their parents' basement, and spends the next 5 years playing video games and smoking pot and not amounting to much and isn't happy with their life, but something just got off track when they had to go and figure out their own schedule and figure out, how to be their own person. Or in various ways, they kind of get derailed when they hit that first major roadblock that nobody can bail them out of. Okay? So how does this type of internalized belief manifest in our psychological habits? So one of the main ways is that you might find yourself giving motivational priority to what I call emotional fixes over real fixes. Okay, so instead of, for example, habitually working to understand and solve problems, you might habitually work to manage your emotions about those problems. And this is subtle, because it's not like you're directly wishing the problems away out of existence. Okay, that's not how you would think about it, but in effect, these habits add up to a kind of implicit, unstated desire to manipulate your feelings as a substitute for manipulating, aka actually changing, reality. So what I've learned in working with this belief is that there are all kinds of ways that we maintain and reinforce this mentality in ourselves as adults without any awareness of doing so. And here are just a few examples that I frequently encounter, again, in myself, in my therapy clients, in people that I've met in the world, and in the psychology research. Okay, so one variant of this kind of mental habit is what I've come to refer to as pretense at problem solving. Okay, so these are the things we do often inside our own minds to give ourselves the feeling of having successfully wished a problem out of existence, even though intellectually we know that this makes no sense. Okay, so often this takes the form of dwelling on something painful or unpleasant that happened in the past and that can't be undone. This is what we refer to as rumination in the clinical psychology field, and I've studied it quite extensively. Okay, but you feel as if maybe if you go over it enough times in your mind, you can almost kind of think your way out of it ever having happened. Again, you don't put this in words, it would make no sense. But implicitly, that's the one thing that would explain why you keep going over and over it in your mind, even though you yourself know it's only making you feel worse long term and distracting you from actually pursuing goals in the present. Okay? There's also a more future-oriented version of this type of pretense, as I call it, where we worry about hypothetical scenarios that could happen, but that we have no current power to predict or to prevent. Okay, like a medical condition that we have some genetic liability for, but that wouldn't show up until years into the future, or a job that we've applied for and we're waiting to hear back on, or the risk that our boyfriend or girlfriend might eventually break up with us, for example. And even though some part of us knows that there's nothing we can do to get the answer from Google or to finally get that one reassurance from our boyfriend or girlfriend that will forever put our minds at ease, still, we spend hours, potentially, Googling and reading different forums and different, what used to be answers with Quora responses about this or that thing that you're worried about, okay, or asking for reassurance, or just mulling over the problem in our own heads repeatedly, not because we really believe it will help us, but because it gives us the feeling as if we might. Okay? It's an emotional fix. And this type of neurotic worry, as it's often described in the field, it goes hand in hand with various anxiety disorders, like generalized anxiety disorder, but you don't have to have a full-blown anxiety disorder to be prone to this kind of habit. In fact, many people aren't or don't have a disorder, but they clearly have this kind of underlying habitual thinking pattern. Okay, similarly, you might occasionally indulge in the kind of idle fantasizing that I would call pretense at planning. Okay, so what do I mean by this? So this can include something as simple and as common as making little promises to ourselves or to other people that we kind of already know we're not going to keep. Okay, so like saying, oh yeah, I'll definitely look up that book when I get the chance. Thanks so much for recommending it. Or yeah, we should get together sometime. But you kind of know it's not going to happen, but you just say it, right? It feels good to say it in the moment. We all do this on occasion. I'm sure that I still do it and occasionally catch myself, or someone who's heard me give this talk catches me, and then that's embarrassing because I'm doing the thing, that I told people not to do. But if you think about what this is doing to our own psychologies and how it's gradually chipping away at our credibility, both with ourselves and with others, right? It makes us less likely to take ourselves seriously when we actually do set our minds to something. And I've seen the more extreme forms that this can take in some people who are really in a rut. Okay? I think it's better on the whole to let go of such pretend plans and to be really ruthlessly honest with ourselves and those that matter to us even a little bit than promising and then not delivering. Okay? And then this can also include some more elaborate fantasies where we imagine ourselves as a famous intellectual or entrepreneur, or we savor the feeling what we'd get if we were to actually write that book that we've been saying we would write. I'm using, again, largely familiar examples, okay? Or maybe we share the idea for the book with a friend, and then this gives us a little taste of like the visibility, the validation that we'd get if we actually wrote the damn thing. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with visualizing future successes and imagining how great it would be. In fact, that often goes hand in hand with really committing to and enacting difficult, ambitious, worthwhile goals. But if you let yourself be satiated by the fantasy, okay, without then proceeding to the step of formulating a realistic action plan and really thinking through the potential obstacles, there's actually really good research now showing that you're less likely to work toward your goal than if you'd never indulged in the fantasy to begin with. So it's better not to do that unless we're then prepared to make a plan, a real one, okay? And then there's another closely related variant of this kind of wish fulfillment-based thinking, which is the tendency to elevate other people's minds, other people's beliefs, wishes, desires above reality. Just as we might do with our own beliefs, wishes, and desires. So, for example, you might find yourself caring more about winning a debate or an argument than about actually figuring out what's true, to the point that you might even pretend to know more than you do on a given topic. I find this is especially common when we discuss political topics, especially in this alarmingly post-truth cultural climate that we find ourselves in. Okay, but that's certainly not the only place where it can show up. Another way this sometimes manifests is when we fish for compliments or we seek reassurance from other people by making little self-deprecating comments. I'm sure my husband is going to give me a dirty look when he hears me say this because, again, it's an ongoing work in progress for me to lay off this habit. This is when we say things like, I look so fat in this dress, or I'm such a klutz, right? In hopes that we're going to get the validation and that emotional quick fix that then kind of frees us from the responsibility of actually having to figure out what is my standard here, what do I really want, and how do I enact it in reality. Okay. Another variant of this is over-apologizing, which, again, something that I'm prone to that you might even get to catch me on in the course of this talk, depending on how things play out. Okay. And this serves as a kind of emotional reassurance that you haven't stepped on someone's toes, you haven't done anything wrong, even though objectively you know that you have nothing to apologize for, okay, by your own standards. So the flip side of these things, of course, can also happen where we explicitly lie or we withhold relevant information from people that we care about in particular because we're afraid of hurting their feelings or of jeopardizing their view of us in some way. And we're going to touch on some of the destructive consequences that this kind of withholding can have over time when we talk about solutions and strategies in a moment. So we've heard about a bunch of ways we can go wrong. So now, how do we fix it? Okay, what do we do with all these findings about ourselves? Okay, so knowing now that we've discussed some of the psychological habits to watch for, let me give you guys some insight on how you might go about the work of reprogramming your psychologies, these and other habits like this over time. In short, the way to reprogram your thinking, feeling, and action habits is A, to identify them as explicitly as possible whenever they come up. B, to consciously widen your scope of awareness so that you can identify what's true and evaluate what's good for you based on all of the evidence available to you. Even when, especially when, it doesn't automatically occur to you, it doesn't light up for you as easily or as quickly as the things that are already congruent with your current programming, okay? Something that doesn't feel motivating for you to think about or to attend to, but that you consciously identify as relevant. And we'll see some ways in a moment that you can prime yourself to be more attuned to this kind of information, to make it more salient, kind of bring it more into your line of sight, okay? And then C, perhaps most important of all, in fact, I'm quite certain that this is ultimately where the real change happens, okay? And everything else is sort of the preparation and the context and the lead up to it. You got to take action on the basis of whatever it was you figured out, whatever fresh knowledge you gained through this identification process and this expansion of your awareness to consider new and relevant facts. Okay, you've got to act on it in order to really cement it into your psychology through direct confirmatory experience in reality in the world. Okay, through embodied experience, as we sometimes call it. Okay, now notice here the task is to identify your automatized, your internalized thinking, feeling, action habits, and expand your awareness around them. So you can grasp the relevant facts that can then inform your thinking and action. This is not the same. This is really, really important and I think bears saying and maybe even repeating. Okay, this is not the same as shoving your unpleasant, unwanted, implicit thoughts, your feelings, your motivational urges out of your awareness, or trying to change them directly by an act of force, trying to squelch them out of existence, okay? Trying to do this, trying to squelch an unwanted thought or emotion is just as futile and self-defeating as trying to squelch the fact of your current hair color or your current weight, okay, or some fact about your physical self. Now, there are actions you can take in reality in order to enact changes in these aspects of yourself over time, right? Whether by changing your diet or going to the hair salon or coming to a talk like this and reading books and implementing some of the strategies that we're going to talk about, okay? But what you can't do is you can't change these features of yourself, whether psychological or physical, by a direct force of will, okay? What you can do by direct force of will is you can choose to orient your mind toward reality, right? Going back to that insight about this primary choice. You can choose to see it when it's presented to you. You can choose to look toward it rather than away, and then to take action accordingly, okay? And so these are the processes we're going to leverage, processes that we can directly enact and that then change what we look and feel and think and act like over time. That's what we're going to leverage to reshape our psychology over the years, over the days, weeks, and years. Okay, so one way to help yourself remember to reorient your mind toward reality, especially when your mental habits are maybe pulling you somewhere else, is surrounding yourself with concrete external cues or reminders of what it is you value so much about honesty and about the kind of integrity, the kind of virtue that you're aspiring to cultivate in yourself. Okay, one really important source of such inspiration can come from art. can come from, for example, fictional portrayals of characters who concretely exemplify the virtues and the traits of character to which you aspire. Okay? Obviously, the heroes of Rand's novels have largely played that role for me and have been a great source of inspiration in my own quest for self-improvement. Okay, but so have a lot of other virtuous protagonists that may resonate with some of you to varying degrees. Okay, from Jean Valjean in Les Miserables to Captain Picard in Star Trek, The Next Generation specifically, to arguably Professor Dumbledore in Harry Potter, which is particularly salient to me now because it's my first day ever in London, and so I'm thinking about Harry Potter. Okay, but just as importantly, you also, of course, you don't want to just rely on fiction, right? That can be only so convincing to us in itself because someone made these people up. So how do we know that a real person can really embody these qualities? But you also want to seek out real-life living people who exemplify at least some aspect of the virtues that you're seeking to emulate. Okay? You shouldn't see this yet. It's distracting. I'll explain in a moment. Okay, so who are the people that you trust and respect the most in your own lives, especially when the stakes are high? Okay? I have been fortunate enough to assemble a whole host of such people over the years and even got to have a bunch of them in my wedding party, which is particularly relevant because this is causally a part of the sequence that has brought me here to speak before you guys today, since I'm here on my very belated honeymoon with my husband, which wouldn't have happened if this hadn't happened first. But the relevant point here is that having surrounded myself with people whom I admire, who challenge me to want to be better, and of course, sometimes we challenge each other and we're all working on different things, okay? It's allowed me to keep fresh and to keep constantly vivid and salient in my day-to-day life what it is I'm striving for and why it's so important to me. And of course, you don't have to fill your wedding party with such people in order for them to serve this function for you, okay? You could also simply learn about the people that you really admire, read their books, watch their TED Talks or their YouTube videos, read their biographies. Even on Wikipedia, sometimes you'll learn things about people who just seem kind of inhuman and unreal to you that actually kind of make them a lot more relatable, okay? And call them to mind when you need some spiritual guidance or inspiration. I think this is the legitimate version of the what would so-and-so do kind of meme that we often hear in the culture, okay? And it's not the same as just slavishly following whatever they would say, right? Or just doing whatever they would do blindly without kind of developing your own standards. But it's a matter of helping you to conjure up what you admire and why you admire it by making it really vivid and concrete for yourself in a way that you can see outside your own head. Okay, so when you think about who are those people, the exemplars that you identify, what is it about them that makes you trust and respect them so much? Okay, you'll probably find certain qualities, like probably these are people who don't pretend omniscience, right? They admit their mistakes, they're willing to say if they don't know something, okay? And by the same token, they're probably really confident and kind of genuinely secure in the claims that they do make. They don't make commitments lightly, if I had to guess, and they follow through on the commitments that they do make. And this is the same sort of evidence, this evidence by which we come to trust another person. I would argue it's also the kind of evidence that allows us to build our own trust, our own self-credibility with ourselves over time. Okay? So when you're feeling lost at sea and you're having a hard time identifying the best, most virtuous, most trust-building way to handle a situation, it can help to conjure these people up. Again, not so you can defer to their judgment or blindly imitate them, but to help you recapture in vivid, concretized form the whole implicit kind of context of knowledge, as we sometimes call it, and all the relevant values that you're trying to internalize to kind of make readily available for yourself. Okay? Now, incidentally, Rand had a whole theory of the ways that both art and love can serve this crucial psychological function for us. And I think this also extends to our broader need to fill our worlds with real-life human beings who exemplify our values. And if we can also befriend and marry and collaborate on important life projects with them, all the better for our souls, of course. Okay. Notice finally here, the basic goal is a cognitive one. It's to bring into immediate, visible, tangible reality a bunch of really abstract, really far-reaching knowledge about the value of the real and about the deadliness, the cost of pretending the unreal, so that you can keep that knowledge real and vivid and accessible and motivating for yourselves. Okay. So finally, we come to the honesty log. So the inputs we get from reality, the perceptual ones of like people we like living happy lives, or whatever it may be, they don't necessarily do much for us by themselves, right? Unless we undertake the really hard conceptual work of identifying and evaluating and understanding the meaning of these experiences. Okay, the process of reprogramming our psychology involves a lot of conscious monitoring, as we've already kind of seen, right, of our current mental habits, of the kinds of motivations that we're prone to, and so on, and the conscious identification and evaluation, processing of facts that can help us correct those habits over time. Okay, notice that these are all internal mental processes. They're things we do in our heads over and over until they start to sink in. There's an inherent fragility to this process, especially for those of us who are prone to mind wander or who have a hard time kind of keeping our attention on one track and being really kind of goal-directed in our thinking. And so there's something often needed in order to kind of shore up this process as a method of kind of being objective and making this process more real and kind of concrete and objective for ourselves. Getting it out of our heads, doing something physical, externalizing it, okay, making it so that we can think about ourselves in the same way we can think about the rest of reality. Writing our thoughts, just writing them down, it does all of those things at once, right? Even prior to saying them out loud to somebody else. Just writing them on a piece of paper, or realistically, these days, typing them into a word processor. Okay, so to structure this task of identifying and evaluating our psychological habits and the facts about reality that can help us improve them, I recommend keeping a written journal in which you can ask yourself some of the probing questions that I've outlined here and to generally monitor and reflect on your soul-building process. So as with any new habit that you might seek to cultivate, I strongly suggest that you make this journaling a part of your daily scheduled routine, or, as frequent, as regular as you can make it. Ideally, I would suggest keeping it close at hand in some form throughout the day, whether in physical or electronic form. Sometimes I use my notes apps, on my iPhone, but there are lots of different ways that we can kind of easily keep track of things in little notes we jot down for ourselves. Okay, and then later we can process those notes during our scheduled journaling time, or when it's really more convenient for us. Okay, so keep it accessible for as much of your day as possible. Once you're doing this, you can start to build up a track record of honesty, as well as look for subtle cues and patterns that help you to catch your honesty undermining habits more efficiently. Okay, so for example, you might start to check the moral tone of your self-talk, as we call it in psychology, or your internal mental dialogue, to see if you notice signs of one of the following things. One would be a kind of duty-driven tone. Okay, so building on what I mentioned before about certain kinds of internalized standards and how they affect our thinking and our motivations, okay, this kind of tone would often be characterized by like self-hating or aggressive or bullying styles of talking to ourselves. Like, oh, you idiot, what's wrong with you? Or, oh, you're so lazy, just get up and do it already. Okay, and a kind of like trying to bully ourselves and push ourselves around and get ourselves to do things, almost as if by force, or as if we're that nagging Jewish mother, but we've kind of taken it on now for ourselves, okay? And there's a general preoccupation, you might notice here, with kind of judging and evaluating yourself as a person and the manner of comparing yourself to some intrinsic moral standard that in fact has nothing to do with the requirements of your life and happiness. It's like, how smart am I? How great am I? Am I better than person X, right? Like the whole slew of standards that get inside our heads and just take on a life of their own that we're comparing ourselves against, but divorced from anything that we actually want in the world that would bring us joy. Or, on the flip side, you might find yourself speaking to yourself in what amounts to a more wish fulfillment-driven tone, like we talked about before. Like when you're kind of wallowing or feeling sorry for yourself or idly fantasizing the way I described earlier, and your preoccupation is mostly with how you're feeling or with wishing you didn't have to feel that way. Like a kind of why me mental tone or attitude. Okay? And by the way, we can be prone to both of these at different points in time. Sometimes they may even kind of talk to each other or alternate, and sometimes they both be present simultaneously, believe it or not. I've certainly seen it and heard it. And to the extent that we find ourselves falling into either or both of these patterns, we can see then about consciously reasserting a more objective, more value-driven, more self-respecting tone, okay? One that really asserts what we want in this world and that we know that we're going to have to do work in order to go after it, okay? Reality is what it is. We can't fake it. Wishing won't make it so. And there's nothing we owe to anyone but ourselves when it comes to our efforts and our energies. Okay? The standard is, what do you want to get out of your life? Okay? Now, of course, this doesn't mean that you won't still pay attention to your feelings, right? And that you won't sometimes judge how well or how badly you're doing at something. That's important here. We don't want to throw out the babies with the bathwater. Okay, but all of these kinds of questions are now subordinated to the ultimate goal of living, right? Of getting what you want out of your life with no further sanction or permission required. Okay, now again, this is a tone and an overall perspective that takes a lot of practice to internalize, okay? And that's true just as much as it is, for less healthy perspectives, which take a lot of time to de-internalize, okay? And sometimes you might find that the kind of practicing the more objective and value-oriented tone, even just in writing every now and then, might make it easier to start shifting into it more naturally, more automatically, even when you don't have a journal close at hand. I've seen this happen many, many times. Okay, so now recall that the kinds of psychological habits I described earlier, they tend to motivate us to hitch our self-esteem to things that take priority over our connection to reality. Okay? I like to refer to these things as our sacred cows. That is, there are any claims about ourselves or about other people or about the world that we live in that we feel so committed to that we find ourselves doubling down, getting defensively angry, or otherwise shutting our minds to any vague suggestion that these things might be coming under scrutiny. Okay? In other words, we'd rather self-deceive and rationalize when faced with the risk of having to give up these sacred cows than finding out that maybe they're not true, right? And to the extent that we've implicitly done this, we'll find our whole motivational apparatus compromised with respect to honesty, particularly when we feel our sacred cows getting threatened. So to check for the presence of these sacred cows in your own psychology, I suggest using your honesty log to do a written inventory of your seemingly unthinkable or unmentionable worst-case scenarios. Okay? So to help you generate this list, think about any contentious themes that you tend to avoid either thinking about or circumstances in which you tend to get mentally clenched and defensive at the first sign of danger, the first sign of questions or criticism. Okay? For any such themes or circumstances that you identify, ask yourself, what am I afraid of? And what would it mean if X worst-case scenario were true? So when I wrote that journal entry 10 years ago, for example, my worst-case scenarios might have included, I'm a basically bad person, right? I'm a basically immoral person, which admittedly turned out to be somewhat exaggerated upon further reflection, okay? But I couldn't have arrived at that conclusion if I hadn't first written it out and openly, honestly reflected on it and kind of asked myself the question, Okay, I find this generally happens once people acknowledge their own fears, their own worst case scenarios. Once they're able to acknowledge and then evaluate the issue realistically in the light of facts and evidence, and to bring all their knowledge to bear on it, it doesn't seem nearly as catastrophic or metaphysically, cosmically threatening to them anymore. Okay, to give some other examples of what might go on this list for some people, this could be a classic kind of imposter syndrome kind of fear, like, I'm not actually as smart as I seem, or I'm not actually good at this job. I'm just pretending, I'm just waiting till someone catches me and not knowing what I'm talking about kind of thing. Or I'm not actually good at life, for that matter, right? It can get really global. Or it might be something more specific, but nonetheless painful enough that you've implicitly elevated it to kind of unthinkable sacred cow status. Okay, like, I don't really love my spouse, or I should never have bought this house that I've just poured 5 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars into repairing, right? What we call sunk cost fallacy, okay? Note here, this has to be a kind of no-holds-barred exercise if it's to be of any use to you. Okay, by writing something down on this list doesn't necessarily mean you're endorsing it as true, right? Rather that it's a claim like any other, and it is subject to rational scrutiny. And that rejecting it uncritically doesn't make it not so, right? Okay, consider here, to help motivate this exercise, let's think about what it actually means when we defend such fears from scrutiny. Okay, it means, in effect, our actual existence, our life in reality as it really is worth less to us than the illusion of being smart or rational or a wise investor in real estate or what have you, okay? To help us really see this clearly and vividly, let's consider that if we're not honestly willing to engage with the parts of reality that seem to threaten one of our perceived values, or standards about ourselves, we're cutting ourselves off from the very data that would actually potentially allow us to save whatever the value in the first place, okay, when there's a legitimate value there. Okay, so for example, a really common example that I've come across, if you refuse to deal with the mounting tension and the lack of intimacy in your marriage, okay, then you're practically guaranteeing that these problems will fester and grow, right? Thus practically ensuring the feared scenario will come to pass. Okay, indeed, there's research now showing that in cases of marital infidelity, that the affairs that are kept secret from the other partners more often lead to divorce than affairs that are disclosed and openly discussed, which is consistent with a lot of what I've observed in my clinical practice. By the same logic, if we're avoiding, let's say, looking at our bank account statement because we don't want to see and face the possibility that our bank account is overdrawn, inevitably it's going to get overdrawn eventually, right? So this is kind of the same idea but applied in less obvious contexts. Okay? So what this means, right, is it's not actually the divorce or the overdraft fees that we're trying to stave off in each of these situations. It's our awareness of these possibilities, right? And the emotional distress that accompanies that awareness. We're sacrificing reality for an illusion if we really think about what we're doing, okay? So the more we practice making clear to ourselves what it is we're really sacrificing, what we're giving up by protecting our sacred cows, the less tempted we'll be to continue to protect them, cute though they may be. I don't know, you may not agree with me on this one. Just some cow from the internet. Okay, you can also use your honesty log to check for the various other kinds of mental habits that we discussed before. Okay, so one set of habits that I find particularly helpful to track in my own honesty log and with a lot of my clients is what I have come to call people mode, or the tendency to prioritize my concern with other people's feelings or impressions above my own independent judgment of what's true. Okay, so for example, I've noticed and started tracking the difference between two different motives that I found myself falling into when I would discuss ideas with other people, okay, or even just when engaged in my own internal kind of dialogue with myself. Sometimes I was driven by a desire to learn or to communicate something, and other times I was driven mainly by a desire to feel as though I'd won the argument. Okay, and when I noticed myself falling into this latter mode of just like wanting to feel as if I'm smart or wanting to feel as if I know, okay, I would ask myself, why is it so important to try to win? What do I gain? And at that point, one thing I realized was that I had this implicit belief, which I hadn't articulated, that my value as a conversational partner depends on my being, in effect, all-knowing and infallible. Or else people would just lose interest and walk away or decide that I was stupid and not give me a second chance. Which once I examined it, on its face was absurd. Because all the people that I actually enjoyed talking to, the people who I had kind of accrued as part of my friend group, or even just mentors that I would reach out to periodically, they had heard me be wrong a whole bunch of times, and they'd stuck around. They'd been wrong a bunch of times, and I didn't just walk away. So it didn't actually make any sense. It didn't square with reality. But again, I couldn't have really caught that until I made explicit what it was that was leading me to kind of pursue this weird goal in the first place. Okay? And it still took a lot of conscious practice and mental reminders before I stopped feeling this fear. And in the meantime, I had to consciously reorient myself toward the goal of learning from my interactions rather than winning them. Okay? For example, I would concretely stock my mind with certain questions. Because when you're emotionally activated into a kind of bad habit, into an unhealthy way of feeling and thinking, it eats up some of your mental resources. And so it helps to have on hand to kind of pre-plan some strategies by which you're going to assert kind of the new, more informed perspective that you're trying to inculcate in yourself. So I would prepare questions for myself, like, what do I really want to know from this person? What are some specific things I can ask them that I know I want the answers to because I'm curious to learn? Okay? Is there anything they know or understand better than I do? In which case, how do I get the most knowledge I can out of them? How do I benefit, from kind of their superior expertise? Okay, how do I motivate them to stick around and share these things with me? Similarly, I've sometimes caught myself slipping into a kind of performative, showy mode when I was getting to know someone new in particular. And I had to remind myself to stop pretending, because pretending I'm someone I'm not isn't really going to achieve my desired goal of connecting with the person, okay? At least not in the long term. At best, it might give me this temporary illusion of connection, but probably at the expense of longer-term connection and visibility, because either A, they figure out, who I really am, I eventually drop the act and they don't like it, or they kind of get put off by the fact that I'm not really letting them see the real me, okay? Neither of which is very satisfying, in the long run. Okay. So finally, and again, most importantly, from my perspective, if you want to get the value of honesty fully vivid and real to yourself, if you really want to have it sink in, you need to take action in pursuit of it, and then carefully attend to the results. Okay? It's deliberate action, not detached intellectualizing or pondering, that brings our ideas and values to life and reshapes our psychologies over time. So what this means, of course, is that you'll need to make your consciously chosen commitment to honesty something that you act on, right? You'll need to go forth and to actually do it before you feel like it, which is really, really important to remember, to expect, and to embrace. So that means you can't really wait for the push to come from your emotions or from somewhere outside of you. You use that volitional, conscious control that nature has bestowed all of us with, and I believe, in this room, and you take the leap into honest, uncensored inquiry and communication over and over again until it becomes more second nature and you do start to feel like it. Okay, so this means, for example, that you deliberately seek out feared or uncomfortable facts that might be relevant for you to know. This might mean you read the news sources and talk to the most reasonable people who don't share your views. Okay, so this doesn't mean, like if you're politically liberal, that you watch Fox, which is not arguably a great example of compelling, news coverage from the opposition, but you find like the best, most well-reported version of, views that you don't agree with, and vice versa, okay? It means you routinely play devil's advocate to your own conclusions and ask yourself what you might be overlooking. It means you not only admit your mistakes, but you track them carefully and you learn as much as you can from them, treating them as valuable sources of feedback from reality. It means that you welcome and even seek out opportunities to pressure test your views. And you practice relishing the discomfort that this brings, okay, until you've learned to love such discomfort as growing pains. So this can include seeking out genuine and honest feedback from people who have knowledge that you could benefit from, right, as we talked about a moment ago, and who are likely to be able to give you a fresh perspective, okay? The fact that it's so hard to kind of be inside our own heads and be objective about our own thinking, the flip side of that is it's often much easier to be objective about other people. We know this because often, we can see that our friend is getting into a really bad way, but the friend doesn't seem to know it, and when we're doing it, it's much harder. It takes us longer to catch on, right? Okay, so use this fact to your advantage. Approach the friend or the professor or the expert on a given topic that you're chewing on and that you're trying to better understand, and present your thoughts or questions to them so that they can push your thinking forward and help you identify what you're missing. Okay? Here too, it's important, of course, to check your motivation and distinguish between cases where you're seeking out feedback because you actually want to gain new knowledge or understanding versus when you're just looking for that emotional quick fix that we talked about earlier in the form of external reassurance, like I was tempted to do in that original situation I found myself in 10 years ago. Okay, one way to distinguish between them is to check whether you're trying to reduce discomfort by asking for feedback or by kind of going towards something like this, or whether you're actually moving toward a lot of discomfort for the sake of improving or learning something new. The fact is, seeking out objective reality-based feedback from people who might actually give it to us, from people we trust and respect, is usually at least a little bit uncomfortable, right? It means making ourselves vulnerable to correction and asking for an investment of time and energy which they may or may not be willing to give us, right? And this often means needing to go out of our way to be extra thoughtful and considerate in how we approach them and ask for their feedback, okay? Relatedly and importantly, this might mean seeking out a therapist to help you structure this process of reprogramming your psychology. Okay, a good therapist, and there are, believe it or not, lots of them around, and I can give some tips for search terms and for kind of qualifications to look for to help you with this, but a good therapist can be really valuable it's sometimes a necessary thought partner for you in this demanding endeavor of really rethinking first just noticing and rethinking a lot of your kind of automatic internalized beliefs and attitudes and habits and motivations, okay? And just in giving you moral support and a fresh perspective while also helping you stay accountable. And they can often provide you with a lot of specialized kind of tools and introspection strategies far beyond what I'll have time to cover in this talk, okay? Now, in addition to seeking out feedback and guidance, you may also find that you need to exercise a great deal of honesty in order to put yourself out there in more direct ways, okay, such as by going after your goals and values in a manner that exposes you to direct feedback from reality. Okay, so for instance, this might mean market testing a new product that you've designed, or sending out a manuscript for review, or actually going on a date, or even putting up a dating profile, depending on where you're at in that process, or applying for a job that you're not sure you'll get, but that you'd be really excited about. Okay, these actions can be courageous exercises in honesty because they require us to acknowledge and to step back from some of the common rationalizations by which we avoid putting ourselves out there, okay? Like telling ourselves that we're being independent and self-sufficient by never seeking out feedback, or by never going on a date, or bringing our products to market, or well, they wouldn't get it anyway, for example, okay? Which often just turns out to be kind of a cover for fear if we examine it openly and honestly. Finally, this also means being willing to have the honest and difficult conversations that you're afraid to have. Not necessarily at the point when they've escalated, so much where the conflict or the tension has escalated to where you have no choice about it, but maybe even when it doesn't feel as urgent yet, meaning it might not be too late to prevent or at least contain the damage, okay? Most of us in this room have probably experienced either that really difficult breakup conversation or the really difficult, the negative feedback
that we gave an employee or that we received from a supervisor and that we had avoided and dragged our feet on. But then when we finally sat down and did it, it was a tremendous release for both parties involved. Okay, perhaps even bringing us a greater sense of closeness, of warmth, mutual understanding and affection, even when the outcome turned out to be really painful or sad. So as we've seen, the work of improving our moral psychology involves the willing acceptance of a lot of uncomfortable, even painful facts, starting with facts about ourselves, about our own psychologies and the ways they might fall short. But I suggest doing more than merely accepting these facts. I suggest celebrating and glorying in our acceptance of them. Okay? And of any other facts that we will ourselves to attend to, even though the inertial force of habit tries to pull us away from them. What we're celebrating is our raw, naked choice to turn toward reality and thus to really, actually live our lives. Okay? To affirm that we love our existence enough that we want the real thing, that we don't want to settle for a cheap imitation, an illusion. We want it, failures and struggles and faults and all, and we're willing to pay that price of facing the parts that don't look very good to us yet, okay? So savoring the feeling of clean, undistorted vision, courage, authenticity, elevation, and pride that accompany the full, honest use of our mind, even when doing so is really painful or difficult, perhaps especially then. Hitch your self-esteem to this. Okay, remember, the choice to face reality, however complicated or unpleasant, this idea that that is the essence and the source of any hope that we might have at developing the rationality, the independence, the productiveness to live a really fulfilling lives. Okay? So pride yourself on the exercise of this basic virtue above all else, even if it means giving up the illusion of whatever other virtues and estimable qualities you may have implicitly staked your self-esteem to up to this point, or whatever momentary pleasures or bits of relief you've been getting to indulge in here and there for a moment or two at the cost of betraying your own trust. Quoting one more time from that same 2009 journal entry that got me started on this whole journey and brought me here today, here's how I experienced this shift for the first time. Quote, "I love myself sincerely and fearlessly and unqualifiedly for the way I've written this. I haven't felt this pure, unadulterated admiration for myself in a long time, and I think it's largely because I haven't acknowledged my own immoral parts either. I couldn't trust my judgment of the good parts because on some level I knew that I was denying the bad parts." In sum, you can't change your soul overnight. You can't. But you can choose to face reality, here and now, and in every moment of your life going forward. Doing so is a noble and a love-worthy act in and of itself. Failing all else, let that be the foundation on which to build the rest of you. In short, I invite you to love yourself enough to fight for your own trust. Thank you so much, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for questions.
All right, we have about 20 minutes for questions, so please raise your hand if you have one.
Finally get to cough.
Hello, Gena.
Hi.
Hello.
Ah.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Sure.
Wanted to ask you about what you think the psychological effect of indulging in white lies is, and generally greasing the wheels of social interaction. Because in a work situation where most of us structure the greater part of our self-esteem and life goals around, it's undeniably true that the more people like you and the more you become friends with them, the more likely they are to work with you and do things for you and that you're therefore able to succeed in your goals. But that inevitably involves subverting or suppressing reality and your honest opinion on many things.
So I think...
Can I just say,
Yes.
if anybody has to leave before we finish, can you please leave from the doors upstairs and not here so that we don't see you on the live stream? Thanks.
I mean, nothing personal. But, thank you for your question. So I think whether it's inevitable, as you put it. So first of all, I don't think this is a duty any more than anything else is the moment that we elevate this idea, okay, don't ever fake reality, don't be dishonest, don't tell lies, to this kind of duty-like status where it's like above and exempt from our goals and our needs, in order to live. I think it defeats its own purpose. So we have to kind of think about it in the context of, well, what does it mean to practice this virtue that I associate with like acknowledging the facts of reality in a work context where sometimes people do things that if I commented honestly, would get me fired or just make a lot of enemies. So if we really contextualize what we mean by not faking reality and by being honest in this context, I don't think it's as inevitable perhaps as it might seem or as it might feel to, I remember exactly how, to obfuscate a lot of facts in order to like grease the wheels and to get along. Because what that doesn't require is that you disclose everything that's on your mind. I think that would be crazy to do in a lot of different contexts, right? Being honest, is first and foremost about kind of how we relate to ourselves, kind of how we think through these issues. Doesn't mean that we owe all the truth and nothing but the truth to everybody that we interact with. And I think there are lots of ways in which we grease the wheels that involve considerations other than just like, what are the naked facts? They involve considerations like, what do I value about this person? Why am I working with them? What is relevant for them to know? What do I want to make sure that they know in order to make sure that they're not, that they don't feel unappreciated by me? What are the things I appreciate, which may be the more useful things to share? The things that annoy me, I'm going to find ways to work around, or I'm going to, if and when it actually starts to interfere with my work or interfere with the success of our endeavor, I might have to find ways to give that feedback, but I want to find a constructive way because the goal is not to alienate them. The goal is to, achieve our mutual goals better. And so if I just put them on the defensive or sound mean, that's not really going to achieve the goal. So if we think about it in terms of the full context of like, what are our goals? And if we consider the importance, the value of other people in our lives in a way that I think allows us to think about other people's psychologies much more kind of thoughtfully and compassionately and in this value-oriented way, just as I've modeled how we might do that for ourselves, where I'm not just thinking like, how do I bully myself into submission or like pretend away this feeling I don't want to have, but what makes it important to me? What makes me want to make this change? And like, whose side am I on, right? Am I my own best friend or am I my own enemy? You can imagine kind of applying a similarly different approach with a colleague or with, again, depending on your relationship with them, where you're able to present even constructive feedback in ways that also convey a mutual respect, that convey, a desire to grow together, that convey your own vulnerability as well, in ways that make you more likable rather than less. So I would argue when we really practice this in earnest, I think if we're doing it right, I think over time it should make us more likable, it should make it easier to get along with us rather than harder. So that may seem kind of contradictory.
What would you have to say about blind spots? Like you mentioned other people noticing bad aspects of like your psychology, but yeah, more generally.
Yeah, so I would say, we have them. And so that's something we can be aware of, that we have them, that there are certain things that will be harder for us to notice and appreciate and to catch in ourselves than it will be for other people. And there's a lot we can do about that, right? Seeking feedback is one of the things, and kind of finding ways to track the things. So One of my favorite quotes of all time actually is from Darwin, who wrote in his journals, as I understand, he was reflecting on how over the years, sometimes he's come across a fact or a finding that didn't seem to agree with his theory. And he had developed this habit of immediately of catching that and writing it down and making sure he's tracked it, because he'd noticed this tendency to kind of forget those things and to let them fall out of his mind unless he was really, really vigilant about writing them down. And I think that's kind of an example, that's just a case of confirmation bias, which turns out we all are prone to, that, once we believe something or expect something to be true, we're less likely to kind of notice and really pay attention to things that disagree than things that agree with our theory, or with our current view of things. So that's something that once we know about it, we can work extra hard to compensate for that, right? Like we can either talk to the people who disagree with us to see if we've missed something, right? Which is one thing I definitely recommend. To kind of do the uncomfortable, when we find ourselves just kind of preaching to our own choir, or like, this echo chamber phenomenon where it's really easy to express our views because everybody's just going to agree with us and echo them back. That's probably not a case where we're going to catch our blind spots very well, right? Whereas if we talk to the smartest person who thinks we're wrong, the person who makes the best case for a different perspective or for a different argument, we're much more likely to discover, oh, wow, yeah, I never even thought of that, that I didn't even realize that I'd never considered this example, of like whatever like political phenomenon that I don't actually know how I would address on my view. So I need to go and like think about this harder or do more research, that kind of thing. So I think, and still will sometimes miss things, but then kind of being willing to acknowledge when that's pointed out to us. Yeah. Who's next?
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
My question is, would you say that there's a utility to lying, in the sense that I think, especially my personal opinion is, lying has become more of like a social norm or a language in our society, right? Like, so you're sitting in an interview and someone goes, why do you want this job? You don't want this job, right? Like you need to eat, you need somewhere to live. You have to lie through that thing. Like no one has ever honestly been like, I've been dreaming of being a data processor at Google since I was 5. Like no one does that, right? Like no one's like, I want to be a mid-level strategy manager at a fintech firm or whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Or when your friends say, like, what's wrong with me? You can't actually give them the truth, because on some level we all know our personal truths. But when we talk to other people, there's this sort of social expectation of lying and the sort of utility it performs. And I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. That's a great question. So there's tiers of things that I want to say about that. So one thing is that it's true that often there's clear social pressure on us to tell a certain story, or to make things out to be more positive than they seem. And that's probably what most of us do in those contexts. I'm aware of examples to the contrary, and not just that, but I'm aware of that going really well for people. In other words, when someone's kind of come forward and been willing to say the thing nobody's expecting them to say, like to kind of call out the fact that, okay, look, who are we kidding? Of course I don't want to like check out your groceries at this, like I'm doing this because it's going to help me actually study up and save so that I can be a writer, which is what I really want. And that's honestly why I'm here. And I'm really excited at the opportunity to get to move forward. If I were the employer and I were interviewing someone like that, I'd be really impressed. Not everybody will be, right? And of course, like some people are going to be put off. You can't please everybody, right? If you're doing things right, no way you're not going to make some enemies along the way. Like, I think those are all true things. But I think the question is to really weigh in a kind of long-term principled way, like what are the costs and benefits over time of being a certain kind of person with these people and these interactions versus, putting on a show, or versus like saying a certain line, and kind of how, in terms of utility, kind of relative utility, what does this mean for if they do hire me? Like, am I going to have to now put this lie into, like, am I going to have to put on a show every day at work? And is that really an environment where I want to be working? And if you can find that job where honesty is celebrated, because I do think there's variability in like the corporate cultures, academic cultures, where you might find yourself, if you find those people, again, who actually like and celebrate open, honest feedback and communication, A, you're going to be a happier person because now you can kind of relax and speak your mind, right? But B, that redounds on your character over time, right? That's going to affect the kind of person that you're kind of shaping yourself to be through these daily interactions with those people. Okay, so that's A. B, and this may seem to contradict A, but I think they're kind of nuances of the same point. Lying, I want to be really clear. Lying is not the same per se, or the virtue of honesty is not, in this kind of rich conception of it as a virtue, it's not just the virtue of not lying, or of just like, telling the truth in some kind of simplistic, primarily social sense. There are definitely contexts in our lives where the right thing is to tell a fib, or to tell, the really obvious extreme cases are like, somebody with a gun comes to your door and asks, like, where are your kids hiding? Like, of course it's not the virtuous thing in that moment to say, oh, they're upstairs in the bedroom. Like, lie through your teeth. Say whatever you need to say, right? And that's a really extreme case that I think came up with Immanuel Kant, who actually thought we had a duty to not lie. And that's a very different view than what I'm sharing with you today, right? So there's a lot of context to consider when you're thinking, like, is this a case where I want to tell a lie? And you can do that in a way where you're really honest with yourself about what you're doing, or you can do it in a way where you kind of rationalize it to yourself and you kind of, over time, convince yourself of the lie, because that kind of makes it easier to tell it. But again, that now comes at the cost of your own self-credibility, your own character, your own just like informed consent. Like, do you even know anymore which job you actually want and why you're doing it? Or like, has this become the thing you've settled for because you've been telling yourself this story? So fundamentally, it's about kind of how do we relate to ourselves around these things? But I do think even social honesty can pay off in unexpected ways sometimes. Here, I'll let you lead the...
I heard what you said before about when you're in a...
Great, I can hear you just fine.
I heard what you were saying before about when you're in a debate or an argument. Oh, here we go. Back.
All better.
And the whole wanting to win versus wanting to teach and persuade thing. And I think when you teach or persuade someone or get someone to come around to your view, you actually feel like you've won. But I was just thinking about what you were saying about how it might be something specific to objectivists or students of objectivism, because one, we're an intellectual minority, so the world's against us. Two,
right.
Two, if there is to be a future, the world has to embrace rational ideas and and embrace freedom and so on. But also, the philosophy is a system, and if you can't sort of justify something in the objectivist ethics relating upon which some sort of political theory rests, i.e. the validation of individual rights, or the need for, to choose, basically, I'm getting distracted, but basically, if you can't defend the steps in the ladder, then the rest of it is a floating castle, and really you've just taken that on faith. Do you think that's something that particularly applies to objectivists?
So I definitely think it's something that applies to a lot of objectivists, yes. And I think as you mentioned, I think people who adopt either a more radical or more fringe or non-mainstream set of views, and to the extent that you're kind of committing to this whole interconnected system, right, of related ideas that all stand or fall together, B, I think both of those things can definitely make it more motivating potentially, again, to the extent that you're kind of putting the feeling of being right above like actually finding out what's true. It can make it more motivating to do that thing I described, where you get really, really defensive about your views and where you become this, really dogmatic, annoying kind of like, the person nobody wants to have to debate. What's that?
Online trolls.
Yeah, absolutely. Online trolling. But that also goes to demonstrate, I don't think objectivists are the only ones who troll. Right? Like, I don't think that this is like a phenomenon unique to objectivism. I definitely think those aspects will put it, will kind of put someone more at risk, so to speak, all else being equal. But I think it's also true of a lot of other people who either are or aren't, but who, especially to the extent that they've kind of staked out a view that is either like controversial or in some way they've kind of staked their identity on that view. Suddenly it makes it much harder to kind of just entertain the possibility that, wait, maybe I don't understand this fully, or maybe, maybe it is all kind of hanging, castle pie in the sky, and I need to kind of start from scratch and re-examine my assumptions. And if so, I want to know about it, because I'd rather not waste my life, arguing for something that turns out to be false, right, or just incomplete or flawed. Yeah, good question.
All right, so first I'm gonna, is it on? Okay, great. So my point was actually touching on what he said about the people that want to be right, but in two extreme cases. I'm sorry if my accent is not understandable, but I'll try my best.
Everything's very clear.
So you have in one side, you have the alcoholic, the addiction side, the people who had been addicted either to alcohol, drugs, food, whatever you want to say, and have been rejecting the problem, because the illness is not the alcohol or the drugs, it's the fact that they don't know how to deal. And you talked about the connective parts. So they lost their way to find, for example, establish an honesty log. They're not able to deal with the reality that you're talking about. And I found it really interesting, because for certain people without addiction, or just having like, let's say, I don't want to say normal issues, but we all have issues. But then we're able to see what you're talking about, and as you say, is a process.
Absolutely.
But for people who are addicted to something, it become way more, because reality is what they're trying to escape, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So how can they deal with that? I mean,
great question.
And then in the same way, from what he was saying, there are some people, especially nowadays. I mean, I don't want to touch on the meditation, but not the mindfulness itself. But for example, going to Peru for the ayahuasca. Yes, a plant that you have to have a shaman, and they mix these two plants, and you drink it, and you basically confront yourself. So you basically get the reality out of yourself. It's really dangerous if you have, from what I heard, if you have a bad shaman, because then you can just flip over. But it worked. There was a French producer who's gone there, and he documented as well. And there's nowadays, it costs a lot of money to do it. But I mean, if you need a good shaman, then that's great. But then
I know of some you can find even closer.
Yeah, but basically nowadays these people say that they've been to the edge of themselves. They came back and they know all the reality. They confronted all their everything. But now they
good for them.
As he said,
impressive.
They don't want to be wrong. Yeah, they just don't want to be. So you have in one side people that don't want to confront reality, and people that are telling you, I confronted my reality.
I'm upset with having confronted reality. I now know reality.
No, I
don't
know,
go telling me that I don't know reality.
Yes, so you have these two sides, and how do you reconcile them?
That's really okay. So thank you. No, it's okay. This is fascinating, and both great questions. So if I may reframe slightly the distinction that you make, I don't think these are two such different cases in a certain fundamental sense. I think both are scared to confront something in reality, right? And in one case, it's because they think they've done it already. In the other case, it's because they're really far gone from, not having done it for a while, and reality actually is really hurtful and scary and seemingly undealable with. So I think they're actually different cases of the same thing, where something makes reality scary and hard to deal with. So to take your addiction example, now there are a few different things that I'm going to say, and I'm going to try to say them quickly, but I think it's important. So the first thing I'm going to say, so it's funny, you mentioned the honesty log in the context of addiction, because full disclosure, part of my inspiration for the honesty log, or at least the way I've now come to describe it, is a component of the Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous and 12-step program model, a lot of which I don't endorse, and lots of differences philosophically and clinically in my approach and the 12-step approach. But one of the things that I think the 12-step approach does really well is the moral inventory. Literally, that's what it's called. You do this moral inventory where you honestly face, whatever the people that you've hurt and the consequences, the costs that your drinking or your narcotics use has caused in your life. And, then it's packaged with other things like you admit your helplessness in the face of God, and I wouldn't necessarily, I don't think that that's quite the way to frame, the truth of the situation. But the fact is that among our most effective treatments for addiction, for substance use disorders, and other forms of addictive behavior are the treatments that incorporate some version of this component in a way that is made palatable, in a way that's presented as part of a larger set of tools and resources to help somebody grapple with those really hard truths while having the support, while having new hope and kind of new perspective in order to make that more motivating, okay? So then the second and related thing I'm going to say is I'm not recommending this as like the end-all and be-all, this is all you ever have to do, and then you're going to be healthy and fine. And clinically, I definitely don't do this on the first day that I meet somebody. Like I'm developing this whole clinical approach to cultivating cognitive integrity, but I don't start that process, at least not explicitly, on day one, because I think there's a lot of resources that a person needs to have online that there are lots of ways clinically that I can help them kind of shore up those resources to kind of have a few success experiences so that they have some basis already for feeling like, I can do things. It's not the end of the world if I face a mistake or if I kind of reckon with the ways that this has cost me in my life. And where we've built a rapport, where the person knows I have their back and I'm not just going to use the things that they say against them to kind of become the bullying, Jewish mother and yell at them for their drinking problem, right? So I think there's lots of other ways that we can make this easier and more motivating for ourselves, and I've seen that work really effectively even with people who are severely mentally ill, including people with bipolar disorder. People with schizophrenia are sometimes able, we're learning ways to actually engage somebody around their delusions, which we thought was impossible before. If someone has a delusion, by definition, it's completely, it's fixed, it's inflexible. Trying to argue with it is absolutely futile. And that's often true, depending on how you approach it. But it turns out there are certain questions we can ask to just kind of warm somebody up to the idea that there might be alternative interpretations and to make that a little bit less threatening for them. So, yeah, it's really hard. And I think that if we consider the whole person and consider the context of why these things are so useful, we can find ways to make it more palatable.
No, we have time for one more question.
Sorry, we can talk afterwards.
Yeah,
so
please keep it very brief so that Dr. Gorlin has time to answer.
Okay. Hi. So
Hi.
I agree with everything you're saying, but I also wanted to ask the connection between understanding that our body is a barometer to the feelings of truth and being able to help people recognize that their pains are the negative thought processes, and each part of your body will resonate at a part of where that negative thought process is emanating. And because your body keeps trauma, it also can be released through physical massage or stretching or yoga and all these processes. And linking what you do into the actual body work that's also occurring. And how does that... Because everyone's saying, where do you find your truth? Mm-hmm. And everyone has a purpose, and your truth is within you. And if you can talk from your own truth and the music that resonates, that passion that drives you, everyone's bottling it, and it's really holding back their throat. It closes their body up. They're unable to express themselves. So someone who's holding back their words are actually in this posture. But sadly, the posture that we're also holding as we're working these days is actually stopping people from recognizing their confidence. So if I'm talking like this, you can hear the shakiness in my voice. But if I decide to breathe and bring back my shoulders and say, hi, guys. We
need a question now if we're going to get an answer for it.
I'm just asking, has that understanding been linked yet? Because it's frustrating to hear this and understand this question?
Yeah, so I won't go on at too much length, though it would be easy. But briefly, I want to say, so my expertise, so you mentioned mindfulness before very briefly in your question. So the way that a general recognition of what you're talking about, I think, has kind of seeped into clinical psychology and certainly informed my approach, is that we very often try to raise awareness of bodily sensations and of kind of the physical manifestations of how we're feeling, of the mental states, that we're in, as a path toward greater self-awareness, and then also as a mechanism of change in its own right. Like you're saying, once we kind of recognize, we adopt a whole kind of physical posture and we tighten up and our muscles are doing something and our breath is doing something of a very particular sort when we're in our, I'm helpless and life is against me and I'll never amount to anything schema, as I would call it, right? Like when we're kind of like embodying those beliefs. And so noticing, being able to just connect to our physical states is a path toward noticing that those beliefs are active and then trying to articulate them. So absolutely. And then on the flip side of that, I wouldn't necessarily agree with the point that all of the truth is inside of us, in the sense that I think there's a lot that we may not know and that we need to learn, and that other perspectives and evidence from outside can help us with. Like if we've only ever been kind of bullied or mistreated, it's really hard to know that there are people out there we can build loving relationships with, for example. We're not going to find it just inside ourselves. We have to see some of the evidence and sort of act on it. So that I'll end on that note, unless we have, I don't know that we,
right.
And then I'm happy to take more questions.
Yes.
One-on-one.
So everybody please join me in thanking Dr. Gorlin.